the usual thing, more glaringly so, I think, than before. You don't negotiate a trilateral or a quadrilateral or whatever you might want to call it, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, Hamas, Palestinian Authority, whatever. What you do is you negotiate with Bibi Netanyahu. And Anthony Blinken, on his 9th trip, is quintessentially versed in that. All he does is negotiate with, and he doesn't negotiate anything that Netanyahu doesn't want to do with Netanyahu. So he is a disaster as a diplomat, which is why you see again and again and again William Burns, the director of the CIA, in a role not necessarily reserved for the CIA, of diplomacy, because he's the real diplomat in the Biden administration. And I include the president in that description because the president increasingly has become no diplomat. Now, Joe Biden was never, ever a real diplomat. He was too wishy-washy. Even when he was Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, we used to rue the day that Joe made pronouncements on foreign policy as though he were a diplomat. Otherwise, in the chambers of discussion, he was pretty sound. He was pretty good. He was better even than the Republican Dick Lugar that we dealt with at that time. But there are no diplomats in the Bush administration. What Blinken does is very obsequiously, he announces, this is my 9th trip to the region. Am I impressive? And I'm going to negotiate. He doesn't negotiate. He talks to Netanyahu, finds out what Netanyahu's positions are, and then he takes those positions into whatever talks he does. Now, the real talks, as I said, are going on with Bill Burns and his equivalents in other places. And it's extremely difficult right now for Bill, I'm sure. I don't know this. I'm not in the room with him, as it were. Extremely difficult because Netanyahu eliminated his major interlocutor, Ismail Haniyeh. And it's very difficult for the Egyptians and very difficult for others like the Qataris because we don't have anyone for Hamas of considerable weight who is actually at the table, so to speak. So this is a disaster. And let me tell you why they're doing it. I've had long discussions all last night and the day before with people who know what they're talking about. People like Daniel Levy in London. People like, well, I won't say any more names, former ambassadors to Israel, whom I've known from time to time. Here's what they're doing. Blinken's trip is designed to do two major things. One, to attempt to be doing something so that there is less of a raucous around the Democratic National Convention and less reason for them to have to address some of the things like 40,000 plus, really probably 200,000 dead Palestinians and U.S. bombs having killed them. They don't want to discuss that. The protesters are about all they'll stand out in the streets. And it's too bad we don't have kids back, youngsters, young men and women back on the college campuses, because that would increase the protests tenfold in Chicago. That's the first reason. Get as much of it out of the headlines and make what is in the headlines positive. Oh, my 9th trip and I'm negotiating and we're close to a peace agreement. Oh, that's the first reason. The second reason is to give Bibi more time to kill people. And that's what we're looking at. And a part of that reason is to forestall the supposedly imminent attack by Hezbollah, militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iran on Israel in response to and retaliation for their killing, brutal killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So those are the purposes of Blinken's trip. No purpose for diplomacy and a ceasefire and a peace agreement. If that were to happen and Netanyahu were to suddenly find it conducive to his wishes to do that, they would go along with it, of course, because it would fit even more into those objectives. They've promised the Iranians, and I'm not sure Bill didn't do this, that there will be a peace agreement, a ceasefire and a peace agreement, and that it will be one the Arab nations and even Iran can support. Therefore, don't retaliate. Please don't retaliate. And if you do, look what we've done. We've dispatched 2 carriers to the Mediterranean, a battle group in the northern Oman Sea. We are getting everything ready. We've dispatched one of the carrier's air wings onto land because you can't keep it going from the carriers, but you can put the planes on land and keep it going around the clock. We've done all this. We're ready to fight you, Iran, but we don't have to. We don't have to go to war. Neither of us wants to go to war. So look, we're going to give you a ceasefire and a peace agreement, and you won't have to retaliate. And if you do retaliate, you might muck up this ceasefire and peace agreement. That'll make your relations with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and everyone else in the region terrible. These are the machinations of the ultimate diplomat in the world, Antony Blinken, and his president back in Chicago, Joe Biden. There's nothing to do with ending the killing in Gaza, except incidentally.
Larry, considering these tensions between Iran and Israel, I think this is a huge opportunity for Blinken and his team to put some pressure on Netanyahu in order to get some sort of ceasefire in Gaza. But do you think the problem is Antony Blinken and his administration, his team, or it's something beyond that?
I think the first problem, the first order of business in answering your question, which is the question, is that it is Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, and as importantly, the congressional leadership, which has weighed in with Biden repeatedly on this issue. Both parties, the Democrats, of course, more forcefully and more convincingly than the Republicans, because the Republicans these days don't want to agree on anything with the presidency. But they've all weighed in and they've said, you're with Israel 100% of the time. You want to give them another $20 billion package? Give it to them. We're with you. We're with you all the way. Don't do anything to disturb Bibi Netanyahu's business in Gaza or in the larger region. That's the guidance, and that's what we're operating on. It is so disgusting, so disgraceful, so contravening of everything that international entities have said, from the United Nations to you name it. But that's what we're doing. That is the empire's prerogative, and that is what the empire is executing right now. And there is no way it is going to do anything that Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want it to do. Now, let's look at that for a moment. He has no interest whatsoever in a ceasefire. None. Until he has done what he has said he wants to do, which is impossible, destroy Hamas, but he will get to the nth degree in that process. He will get as far as he thinks he can get. And he will try to consolidate Israeli control over the Philadelphia corridor, for example, and Rafah. And you're going to have a real problem with Sisi and the Egyptians over that. It's already a sticking point in the negotiations, but he is not going to fall off of that. You are going to get him insisting on a presence, a very robust presence in Gaza post whatever hostilities end, whenever they end. You're going to get him insisting on all manner of control over Gaza. And ultimately, you're going to get Ben-Gvir and his group going into Gaza to resettle it. That's the long-term plan. And that is what Netanyahu is after. So all these things that Blinken keeps talking about in his smarmy press conferences, where he is so concerned, are just that. They're just cosmetics. Netanyahu is going to get what Netanyahu wants to get. And we must not forget for a moment that Bibi's ultimate pressure point is staying out of jail. And that means he's got to keep his coalition together. He's got to keep Smotrich from Ben-Gvir and the others associated with him in his group. And he's got to keep pursuing this war. That's a sine qua non of Bibi Netanyahu's survival. And he's not going to rest until that is either eradicated or gone by the wayside or somehow subsumed in the aftermath of this conflict. I don't know how that's going to happen, which makes me think this is going to go on and on and on until something develops, that some deal perhaps politically develops with the Knesset, with the other people that might be in a position to make a deal, that Netanyahu is home free. He doesn't want an investigation of October the 7th. That's one of the first things that would happen. He doesn't want any culpability to fall on himself or on Likud or on the hard right. He wants all of this to be worked out in the killing. And he wants the killing, therefore, to go on as long as it possibly can. And ultimately, he's not fallen off his desire, which has been a 15, 20-year desire to get the United States to take on Tehran. And he hasn't achieved that yet. If there is one diplomatic point that Bill Burns and others have made crystal clear and have accomplished up to this point, it's getting dicey now, but up to this point they've accomplished it, is the United States has not exercised major military force against Tehran. That's the one accomplishment. And that's principally because we don't want it, because we know how disastrous it would be for the region, for us. And if it boiled down to having to eliminate their nuclear program, we would have to go into Iran with ground forces. And America is not prepared to do that.
It seems that we're all prisoners of Netanyahu's position in Israel. And the United States can do nothing about it, because we have to obey Netanyahu because his position is in danger, and the United States has to help him without having anything coming out of this conflict in order to have any sort of outcome that is in the mind of Netanyahu and his administration. And at the end of the day, Blinken is not capable of convincing him to change his idea. It's unbelievable.
I think your comments are pertinent, to be sure. I think what the United States is looking at from a perspective of its unified vision in the Democratic leadership, and this is big time in the Congress. Some would go further than this, but many would take it if it happened this way, is reestablishment in the Levant of what they call all the time, this term of art is used by them ceaselessly, reestablishment of deterrence within Israel. That is to say, everyone shakes in their boots at the prospect of Israel coming after their Ismail Haniyeh, coming after their leaders, coming after their military, coming after their state, so they leave them alone. You have to reestablish this invincibility of the IDF, the absolute imperturbability of the Israeli leadership to kill you and kill you and kill you and kill you until you understand. And oh, by the way, to kill 100,000 of you for every one Israeli who dies. That's the calculus. That's what they want to ultimately reestablish in the Middle East. Then they can go back to Washington and do what Tony Blinken did, or was it Jake Sullivan? I forget now. They're both idiots. Oh, it's the most peaceful region in the world right now, about a week before October the 7th. That's what they want. They want it established as quiet. And the only way they see that is the way they have found for the last 20 years, and that's to allow the Israelis to have their head. It comes back to Operation Cast Lead, for example, which that was the point that was made to the IDF when they went into Gaza and killed so many people for a couple of weeks of a killing rampage. Let everyone know, dogs, cats, children, women, men, youngsters, whatever. Let them know by the brutality that you exercise that you do not want to mess with Israel. Well, this is Gaza today, is that writ large across the tapestry of the Levant. Israel is reestablishing, with the United States' major help, deterrence in the region.
Larry, here is a clip that Antony Blinken is trying to intimidate Iran, in my vision.
We affirm the commitment of the United States to Israel's security. That's a commitment that we put into practice virtually every day since October 7th, including when Israel was attacked directly by Iran back in April. In recent weeks, given the heightened tensions, we have deployed additional assets to the region. The purpose of the deployment of these assets is not to provoke aggression, but rather to deter it. to make sure that it doesn't happen, but also to make clear that if it does, we are fully prepared to defend Israel. We've coupled this effort with an intense diplomatic campaign, virtually a global diplomatic campaign, working with countries around the world to send the message strongly to every concerned party not to take any steps that would escalate tensions, that would risk provoking a wider conflict. And this, too, has been something we've been working on from day one, since October 7th. It's been one of our primary objectives, to prevent the conflict from escalating, from spreading to other places. And so this coupling of our military commitments, our security commitments, with an intense diplomatic campaign is something that I'm pursuing on this trip, again, with the intent of making sure that we deter further conflict, but that we're also clearly prepared to defend against it if it comes. But what's most crucial now is that everyone refrain from taking any actions that could fuel further conflict, escalate tensions, and result in the spreading of violence and conflict.
Nima, I couldn't ask for a better exposition of what I just said. Notice too, that in all those oily, smarmy, but direct words about what the real purpose of our support for Israel is, there was no mention of dead Palestinians, no mention whatsoever of the bloodshed, of the cruelty, of the brutality, indeed, of the genocide. Not a word about it. This is quintessential Tony Blinken. He forgot to cry for the cameras. But his exposition there was very much the case in both diplomacy, military, the mixing of the two, deterrence. And as I said, what we want desperately is for Israel to reestablish its ability without our major assistance to deter. And then we'll leave. And we'll go back to the status quo ante. That's what we want. We want Israel back in the catbird seat, able to deter all the people in the Middle East who are nasty people, from Persians to Arabs. We want Israel to do that for us. And we'll give her $3 billion, $4 billion, maybe $5 billion after this a year in order to do that. And from time to time, even more. That's our strategy. That's the empire's purpose. And I will give Blinken credit, though he stated it imperfectly, in my view, in terms of not mentioning it at all. The real crux of the issue here, the dying people in Gaza, polio, starvation, no water, bombs and bullets, which are our bombs and bullets and so forth. But why do that and spoil an otherwise brilliant exposition of U.S. policy?
And Larry, in your opinion, when countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, even Egypt are looking at this message, do you think what would be the perception? What do they perceive from this type of attitude on the part of the Biden administration?
I think the place to start talking about that right now, not that it's the most important part of an answer to your question, but it is the most immediate right now, I think. And that's Sisi in the Philadelphia quarter in Egypt. What are they going to do? Israel is not going to do what we just said, reestablish this aspect of I am inviolable, I am the deterrent agent in the region, if Egypt contests that. And I've got a feeling that they might be getting very close to offering that as their sine qua non. You will divest yourself of the corridor, and you will forthwith or fairly soon, or you're going to have us to contend with. And us means we have a military too, baby. I don't know that the threat will get to that point, but there's some other issues like that too that could spin out of control at any moment, which is why I think Bill is the man in charge of all of this to try and prevent that. But it is an equation that everyone has to keep looking at. If they all want, here it is in a nutshell. If they all won't get back in their box, a box that is tied off by Israel, and the mystique of the IDF, which has been badly damaged in the last 7-8 months, badly damaged. If everyone won't get back in their box and cooperate and act like they're supposed to in the wishes of the empire, and this includes Saudi Arabia, a very obstreperous entity of late, then all bets are off as to how this ends in a way that satisfies what Blinken was insinuating there, that Israel is now back as the deterrent agent, acting on behalf of the United States in the region. All you Arabs and Persians, go away, tend your business, but don't bother Israel, because if you do, they'll kill you like they did in Gaza. That might be an impossible thing to do. And somewhere in these talks, Bill is a very intelligent individual, Bill Burns. Remember, he's the one who, when he was our ambassador in Moscow, sent that very perceptive cable back that said, when Russia says niet, it means niet. Well, if we had listened to Bill at that point and acted accordingly, we wouldn't have the war in Ukraine right now. But that's something we wanted. We wanted the war in Ukraine. Therefore, Bill's words went by the wayside. But Bill is probably in a position now to begin to say some things like that about this situation and to alert the powers that be in Washington. And then, an aside here, open some parentheses. Who are the powers in Washington? Close the parentheses. They're having a convention out in Chicago. Are there any powers in Washington that are really focused on the situation in Ukraine or the Middle East? Or are they subsumed by the selection process, which I admit is going to be a critical election, a very critical election? And they've got a new person, Kamala Harris, who's looking like she might be positive, looking like she might spin the polls up for herself, looking like she might be electable, looking like she might be able to lead the Democratic Party, but they don't know that yet. So, as always with elections like this, and this one in particular, the focus is domestic. So, Tony, get over there and get that thing stopped. Bill, get over there and get that thing stopped. Not because people are dying, but because it might adversely impact our reelectability, or in this case, Kamala Harris's electability. It might put Donald Trump in place, and none of us want that. So that's where the focus is now. So what is the leadership in Washington, and who is giving anybody any advice, and who is Bill saying yet to, or whatever? I don't know. And I don't know if it's getting through to anybody that can make any decisions. And there are lots of people who are screwing up the communications channels, not least of which is the leadership in the Congress.
And when it comes to Iran and their way of thinking, in your opinion, why it seems that they're waiting too much to respond to Israel? But at the end of the day, do you see any sort of strategy behind this type of attitude on the part of Iran?
Well, there are two things operating there, I think, Nima. More than two, probably, but two things from my perspective that are major. And I said this earlier. I said the response would not be swift. I said it on Judge Napolitano's show, and he laughed because I used the Sicilian idea. I said revenge is best tasted cold. I said the Iranians will be that way. They will hit them when they least expect it and in a place they least expect. I don't know if that's still an operational factor. I think that probably the Iranians right now, particularly those who are in a position to make a decision about the use of force, are looking at these negotiations. I don't think if they believe there's even the remotest possibility that a ceasefire might occur and the Palestinian dying might stop, that they would then jump in that and make a mess of it, as it were, by a major retaliation against Israel. And that major retaliation would give Israel the response capability and the U.S. fully behind it, maybe even joining it, to reestablish once again deterrence. Because if the Iranians hit and hit badly and hit well in terms of, destruction of Israeli assets, then deterrence is evaporated again, and you've got to reestablish it. And probably to do that, the U.S. would have to come in fairly largely on Israel's side. So they've got all those things to consider. And they've also got the point to consider that there are other powers and schisms developing right now that they don't want to correct. The Arab world, for example, is getting angrier and angrier and angrier, from Egypt, from Cairo to Riyadh. The Arab street is getting angrier and angrier. I did an interview yesterday with a Beirut TV station, cold call right out of the blue. They wanted me to come on with two other gentlemen and comment on the situation. And one of the things I noted in that was how much they were trying to elicit from all of us the confirmation that the campus protests, the marching, if you will, on the Capitol to protest Bibi Netanyahu's presence in the Congress and things like that were showing a major change in the United States in its position towards Israel. And I did my best. I'm a lone voice, but I did my best to tell them they were pipe dreaming, that was not going to happen. And I created a little bit of rancor, I think, in the interview, because they wanted me to confirm that I thought it was changing, that eventually the U.S. Position with regard to Israel would mellow somewhat and would temper somewhat and would be more realistic and not so wholeheartedly for Israel. But I tried to disabuse them of that. But they are eager to think that about us. And there are people on the left in this country who are eager to think that's going to happen too. And I'll be the first to say, based on my experience with my students for 16 years on 2 college campuses, that might be happening, but it's a slow thing. It's a slow thing. 20-year-olds have to become 40-year-olds and be in positions of power. It'll happen over time, but it isn't going to happen tomorrow morning, and it isn't going to solve this crisis, which was sort of what they were insinuating. So, yeah, it's tough to say why Iran won't jump in and stir this mixture even worse. And it's clear that Blinken and others, and Lloyd Austin in particular, think that the dispatch of military forces to the region and the serious nature of their remarks about those forces is such that Iran's got to take second, third, and even fourth thoughts about doing this, because the U.S. has said we will weigh in with very, very little maneuver room. The U.S. has said we will be with Israel. So I don't know how to answer your question other than I still think the Iranians are going to do something. And I think it's going to be coordinated. I think it's going to be on multiple axes. It's going to involve militias in Iraq, militias in Syria, Hezbollah, and probably the Houthis, and perhaps even some others I don't even know about right now. But I can't guarantee that, and I hope it doesn't happen. But there's a part of me that says I would look at Israel and say, got your just desserts, didn't you?
In your opinion, are we having some sort of negotiations behind the scene between Iran through the back channels between Iran and the United States?
Definitely. I think the Oman and the Qatari channel is multiple, not right now. It's handling the ceasefire and the peace talks. It's handling ancillary talks about the Philadelphia Accord, and it's handling talk about a possible Iran response. And it's handling talk to Iran, don't do it. Don't do it, because we will be there, and you will not like us being there. You will be on the verge of a war with the United States of America.
And who's leading?
That's the message that's being delivered.
Larry, who's leading this negotiation, these talks? Do you think it's Bill Burns or Antony Blinken?
I think, Hochstein is the special emissary for the, Lebanese problem. I think Bill is probably orchestrating some other people whom he has discovered in this process who are decent diplomats, and they're helping him. But I would tend to say that Bill has probably got his finger on almost every aspect of it. He's competent to do that. I mean, Bill is the closest thing to Henry Kissinger that we have without the malevolence of Henry Kissinger. And the double dealing of Henry Kissinger, talking to Nixon about one week ahead, he's talking to Nixon about, I don't think I know where Chile even is. Chile has absolutely no importance to the Cold War. Why are we even talking about it? And then a week later, after he sniffed out Nixon's sentiments, he's saying, make the economy scream and let's bring Allende down. That's Kissinger.
Yeah. Larry, shifting the gear to the conflict in Ukraine, how do you see the response coming from Russia to this attack on the Kursk region?
Well, it's somewhat complex right now to say because there's so many different factors impacting on it. But I would say that from Putin's perspective, and I should say from his military leadership's perspective, because they're briefing him, this is an opportunity they didn't think they were going to get. It's an opportunity to take the very best of Ukraine's military, what's left, and destroy it. They exposed, in other words, I think Scott Ritter said this the other day, maybe Doug McGregor too, but they expose their operational and even their strategic reserve to destruction. And the Russian military is looking at that as a golden opportunity to not only continue essentially massacring what is left of the mainline Ukrainian forces up in the Donbass principally, but also now around Kursk to destroy ultimately what was their strategic reserve and was being used in an almost political stunt type way to reassure the West that Ukraine still had some fight in it for money purposes, and to maybe try, and this would have been understandable from a strategic point of view, maybe try to get into a position that would make subsequent negotiations a little bit more palatable to you, because you'd have some negotiating territory, if you will. I think that's gone by the wayside as soon as it's reclaimed by Russia. So all I see is Ukraine going even faster. And that's what happens when you commit your last forces. And that's essentially what McGregor and Ritter and others have suggested. And I think they may be right, that Ukraine has committed its last strategic reserves. And now they'll probably be wiped out or isolated in that salient that they created in Kursk, around Kursk. I think it's 40 kilometers wide and maybe 12 kilometers deep. And they'll do other things too, like continue to send drones to hit bridges in Crimea or whatever. And these things will have some impact, but it's mostly now, I think, to gain a negotiating position that's a little bit less than abysmal. The problem with this is that Putin knows all this. Putin is not amenable to giving them opportunities and stopping, while they might have an opportunity, for a negotiating position that's a little bit stronger. If they want to invite the complete destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces, which I think is probably Putin's ultimate strategic objective, it was never to take Kyiv. It was never to take any part of eastern Ukraine. It was to destroy those forces in Ukraine that had the capability to give him problems in eastern Ukraine, to destroy Ukraine's military, in fact. And what's made that extremely difficult, of course, for him is NATO support. They never would have held out, in my view, for 6 months without all the NATO support, particularly air defense support, artillery ammunition, and such. And you get a morale boost too from knowing that you have the entire NATO alliance behind you, which is crumbling a bit now. I'll give you. Well, I better not talk about it. I won't talk about that. Just briefly, we're getting ready to go to a conference in Europe that was supposed to be in September. It's been postponed to February of the new year. And there were hardly any hardcore Brussels military types who wanted to come to the conference. Now there are those that will show up. And the conference is all about how to resolve the problems that now confront NATO and the problems that now confront alliance in general, the transatlantic relationship, What has Ukraine done to it? What is the Nord Stream pipeline? That story that just came out, did you see Putin's interview and the ambassador in New York's interview? 3 Ukrainian divers went down and blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Who invented that? I agree with the ambassador in New York for Russia. Who invented that? Who thinks anyone will believe that? But Ukraine has got to stop too, just like Gaza. We're just killing young men and women on both sides, and Ukraine has got almost nothing left.
Larry, what's so amazing about the Russian?
And Nima, as in Gaza, we did this. The empire did this. It had a lot of help with Ukraine, with NATO. NATO gave it a lot of assistance, just as it did in Libya. Yesterday, day before yesterday, article in the New York Times by a woman by the name of Anastasia Edel. There was a line in there. The whole piece was just crazy. But there was a line in there that the tenor of the piece was that Ukraine has lost. But it was lamenting NATO's inability to defend Ukraine. Its lack of desire to defend Ukraine. And in there was this line. I'll probably never forget it. This line said, "It will violate the sanctity of borders with impunity." In other words, what Russia did violated the sanctity of Ukraine's border, and thus, generally speaking, for the entire world. And I wanted to say, lady, where were you in 2003 when the United States violated with impunity the sanctity of the Iraqi border? Where were you later when we violated the sanctity of Somalia and killed people with drones inside Somalia, a country with which we were not constitutionally at war? Where were you when NATO and us went into Libya unconstitutionally and violation of borders? Where were you when we went into other countries, NATO and us together, and violated the sanctity of borders? We set the precedent for this. And she has the colossal gall to write in the New York Times that Putin is setting a precedent for violation of the sanctity of borders. The Chinese have no principle of international relations more solid, airtight, more brought out and paraded before the enemies in the world of China than that principle, the sanctity of borders. It's one of the reasons why they continue to insist that Taiwan is a part of China, because they don't want to have to operate with the violating the sanctity of a border in Taiwan. So they keep insisting that it's a part of China. That's the real reason they do that. But they're hard over on that. You check their UN Security Council positions over the last 30 years, and even when they were fresh caught and just made members of the UN Security Council, that was one of their principal diplomatic points. And it particularly applied to the United States and at that time to Russia, violating the sanctity of borders. And this lady has the gall to suggest that Ukraine has set that precedent. Russia has set that precedent. Where's she been? Asleep? And that's our New York Times. That's the New York Times today.
Larry, Lavrov is talking about that after this attack on the Kursk region, it's not possible to talk with Zelensky, to negotiate with Zelensky and his administration. And do you think that Zelensky is getting to the point to destroy just everything? That right now he's talking about giving permission and giving missiles, long-range missiles, to hit Russia. Is he thinking that he can bring a nuclear war between NATO and Russia? Because the way that he's talking about that, his main goal is this, in my opinion.
You've hit a major point of concern of mine anyway, and that is that we have two leaders, very different types of leaders, if you examine them closely, in the world today. Bibi Netanyahu in Jerusalem and Zelensky in Kyiv, who seem bound and determined to put their regions and potentially the globe in serious consequences that might even involve nuclear weapons. You would have thought that we would have learned enough during the years of the Cold War and in the subsequent deliberations that we had afterwards, and when we got the Russian archives, for example, and saw the deliberations they had, particularly from Khrushchev on forward after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we knew our own deliberations and how significantly that particular crisis and the Berlin crisis the year before cemented in our minds on both sides of the divide that we didn't want to go there, ever, ever. You would think that lesson would have had at least a lasting effect for a few years. But it disappeared, and it disappeared on the day that the president whom I was selected to serve, George W. Bush, abrogated without hardly a word the anti-ballistic missile treaty. That's when it began. I'm sure it had its feet elsewhere earlier, but with the neoconservatives and others. But that's when the insanity began. So that now you have build outs of nuclear weapons complexes all across the globe, modernization of them, the Chinese going hell-bent for leather to build enough nuclear weapons to ride out a second strike, which means a couple of thousand or more better, at least, adding that much danger to the world. And you have people talking about putting AI, artificial intelligence, in control of nuclear weapons. Seriously, Nima, talking about this. You would have thought we would have learned some hard lessons from the Cold War, but apparently we learned nothing. And Zelensky and Netanyahu are the latest examples of, as you just pointed out, the potential for this to spiral out of control at any moment.
And here comes what Washington is talking about in terms of having a long-term offensive in Ukraine on this region, Kursk region.
It was to create a buffer zone. So we're having those conversations to learn more about what their objectives are. Again, if you take a step back from a U.S. perspective, our focus continues to be enabling Ukraine to be a free and sovereign country that can deter Russian aggression in the future. And so that continues to be our focus. As it relates to their operation in Kursk, as I mentioned, they clearly have compelled the Russians to struggle in their response. It has certainly demonstrated the creativity and the battlefield prowess of the Ukrainians. But when it comes to what their longer term objectives are here, that's something that we're still discussing with them. Thank you. Sir.
The key words there, Nima, were at the end, but when it comes to what their long-term objectives are, we're still discussing that. Thank you, General.
And the way that he's talking about Ukraine and their capabilities, it doesn't seem that it matches the capabilities of Ukraine today, because it seems that he's talking about Ukraine even before this war started. But we know the Ukraine is not in the same position right now.
Well, the thing that would have astonished me had I been in that press briefing, and I've been in a lot of Pentagon press briefings, even put some on myself for my students, and use people like the general in order to give it a realistic sense. The first thing I would have said was, you mean they did this without coordinating with you? Or are you just hiding that fact? Or did they not tell you? Did Lloyd Austin or, C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not tell you so that you wouldn't have to lie, whatever. Sometimes that's what they do. They don't tell the public affairs guy what the truth is because they don't want him to have to lie, him or her. But that'd have been my question. Do you mean you don't know what Ukraine did and why? And you're the big supporter? Then the second question I'd want to ask him was, if he would be forthcoming, and he did know something about it, was what was the strategic objective? What do you think the purpose was? If you don't know what Zelensky was thinking or the military was thinking, what's your surmise? Then he probably would have said, well, I'm not going to answer a hypothetical. But that was really a weird answer in my view. But it reflected the truth, probably. I think it probably reflected the truth. We don't know why he did it. And that means that someone was probably not happy with Zelensky.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Surely. Take care.